In the dim light of a room, illuminated only by a flickering lantern, a disciple of Jesus named James sat in silence, his mind in turmoil. The Last Supper was approaching, and while the other disciples seemed imbued with faith and enthusiasm, James wrestled with deep doubts that consumed him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. From the beginning of his ministry, James had always been loyal to Jesus, following him through towns and villages, listening to his teachings on love and forgiveness. But now, in the weeks that had followed the prophecies of betrayal and sacrifice, his heart felt heavy with uncertainty. What if all this is in vain? What if the Master cannot save us, he thought to himself. On the night of the supper, James entered the hall where the others were already gathered. The aroma of fresh bread and wine floated in the air, creating an atmosphere of sacred expectation. Jesus, surrounded by his disciples, looked radiant, although a shadow of concern lingered over him. James looked around and saw his companions, each lost in their thoughts. But a greater worry troubled him, the presence of Judas, who seemed distant and restless. As Jesus blessed the bread and the wine, James felt his heart tighten. He recalled a conversation he had with Judas a few days earlier, where he had mentioned his frustrations with what he saw as Jesus in action regarding the Romans. James wondered if Judas was about to do something desperate. He tried to ignore the feeling, but it was as if a shadow followed him, even on that sacred night. As the supper continued, Jesus spoke about the importance of love and unity. He encouraged his disciples to love one another, and the atmosphere of camaraderie felt magical. But James couldn't relax. He felt a storm approaching. When Jesus announced that one of them would betray him, the silence was absolute. James froze, his heart racing. "Is it I, Lord?" James asked, his voice trembling. Jesus looked at him, and James saw a mix of sadness and understanding in his eyes. "The one who dips his hand in the bowl with me will betray me," Jesus said, and James turned, searching for Judas. Judas's gaze was distant, and James's despair grew. "It cannot be," he murmured to himself. As the supper continued, Jesus's words began to penetrate more deeply into James's heart. He spoke of a new covenant, a new commandment of love. Each word seemed a call to action, an invitation to overcome doubts and embrace faith. Yet, at the same time, the shadow of betrayal lingered. He wondered if he had enough courage to face the truth. After the supper, Jesus led the disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. James walked with the others, but his mind was elsewhere. He felt as if he were in a labyrinth, trapped between loyalty to his master and fear of what was to come. Upon arriving at the garden, Jesus asked them to pray, but James felt the weight of uncertainty on his shoulders. While Jesus went away to pray alone, James remained silent, listening to the whisper of the wind among the trees. He struggled with his emotions and the voices echoing in his mind. What if Judas really betrays? What will this mean for us? He felt divided, powerless in the situation. It was then that he saw Judas slip away, and his heart raced. James decided to follow him, curious and worried. What he found in the shadows was surprising. Judas was in furtive talks with Roman soldiers. The betrayal that James had feared was unfolding before his eyes. "Judas!" James exclaimed, his voice filled with desperation. "What are you doing?" Judas turned, and James saw confusion in his eyes. "James, you don't understand. It's for the good of all. Jesus cannot save this nation." James felt a wave of anger and sadness. "You are making a mistake. Jesus is our Savior." The conversation intensified, and James realized he was losing Judas to darkness. "He is not the enemy, Judas. He is what we need." But Judas seemed distant, his mind trapped in a spiral of frustration and despair. "You don't understand, James. I am doing this so the people can be free." And with that, he walked away, leaving James in a state of confusion and pain. Returning to the garden, James sat in a corner, desolate. He prayed fervently, asking God to illuminate the path. He desperately wished he could do something to stop the betrayal. "Why is this happening, Lord? Why can't Judas see the truth?" The night dragged on, and James found himself in a state of anguish. When Jesus returned, the serene gaze of his master brought a little relief. Jesus knew what was to come, and James felt small before such greatness. "James, you need to have faith," Jesus said, his words echoing in the disciples' heart. "I am with you, even when everything seems lost." At that moment, James realized that faith was not the absence of doubt, but the courage to believe anyway. With this revelation, he stood up, determined not to let Judas's betrayal define his love for Jesus. He joined the other disciples, and together they prayed and sought comfort in the presence of their master. Morning came, and with it, the betrayal was fulfilled. James saw Judas approaching with the soldiers, and in his heart, a mix of pain and compassion arose. He knew that Judas's betrayal was not just a failure, but a human tragedy. When Judas kissed Jesus, the moment was devastating, but James decided he would not succumb to hatred. "No, Lord," he shouted, rushing towards Jesus, but the scene had already been set. Jesus' arrest was swift, and despair engulfed James. He felt powerless, but deep inside, a small flame of hope still burned. He could not allow betrayal to drive him away from the truth that Jesus had taught. As the soldiers led Jesus away, James resolved not to let darkness win. He returned to the group of disciples, more determined than ever. "We must remember what he taught us," James said. "Love will always prevail over betrayal. We cannot lose faith." The days that followed were marked by pain and confusion. James found himself in the midst of a storm of emotions. How could the disciples continue without Jesus? They met in secret, sharing their concerns and fears, trying to find strength in one another. James, in particular, felt responsible for maintaining the group's unity. In one of those meetings, Peter, his friend and fellow disciple, was especially agitated. "We must do something. We need to rescue Jesus." James, however, was aware of the reality. "We cannot confront them, Peter. Jesus taught us to respond to hatred with love. We must trust in God's plan." But James's words were not enough to calm the storm in his heart. He felt caught between loyalty to Jesus and the need to act. It was during this moment of internal conflict that he began to remember Jesus' teachings, not only about love and faith but also about forgiveness and hope. As the hours dragged on, James decided he would not remain paralyzed by fear. He began to gather with the other disciples, organizing meetings where they could pray and share their experiences. "We must honor Jesus in everything we do," he said. "Our mission does not end here. What he did for us should inspire us to move forward." Over time, James realized that although Judas's betrayal was painful, he could not allow it to define his future. He remembered Jesus' promises, the hope he brought to the world, and the love that was stronger than any betrayal. This understanding became the anchor that sustained his faith. One night, while praying together, one of the disciples began to share a vision he had about Jesus resurrecting. "He promised us that he would be with us always," said Mary, James's mother. "We must believe that this is not the end." James felt a wave of hope and gratitude. Her words resonated in his heart, and he realized that their unity was stronger than any adversity. James's experience at the Last Supper and what followed would be remembered forever. His internal struggle, his doubts, and ultimately, his decision to choose love above all became part of the testimony of what it means to be a true disciple of Jesus. Even in times of crisis, he found the strength to believe and love, showing that true faith manifests in the darkest hours. Thus, the supper was not just an event, it was a landmark in the journey of James and the other disciples. Each of them, even in the face of betrayal, learned the importance of love, faith, and hope. What seemed like an end was, in fact, the beginning of a new era of understanding and redemption. James's experience at the Last Supper transformed him from a man filled with doubts into a bearer of hope. He became one of the pillars of the early Christian community, dedicating his life to spreading Jesus' message. And even though Judas's betrayal left deep scars, James knew that love and faith could heal even the deepest wounds. Thus, the city where James and the other disciples gathered became a symbol of transformation. They learned that even in times of crisis, the light of love can illuminate the darkest paths. James continued his journey, always remembering that every challenge was an opportunity to strengthen his faith and spread the message of love and hope that Jesus had shared.